Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm here today to talk to you about Boogie Woogie and the history of what I consider to be one of the most important musical forms that was ever contributed by the African American population. Boogie Woogie actually started right after the Civil War in 1870. And it's a form of music that was generated because the people who worked in lumber camps in East Texas wanted to have some fun after working all day cutting down trees. So they would go back to the mess hall, and there was nothing there to entertain them but one guy and one piano. And these piano players were blues piano players. But the people that worked in the lumber camps wanted to have some fun and dance. And they'd come up with a dance they called the Boogie Woogie. And this dance is something one guy could do, just moving his feet. And if you've ever seen any films of James Brown, that's basically what James Brown did on stage. He kind of danced around and moved his feet. And it required a lot more upbeat music in order to do this. So the dance was actually called the Boogie Woogie. And the music they played came to be called Texas style piano. I'm sitting here at my house right now. I'm actually sitting at the piano. It's down below here. You can't see the piano, but I'm sitting at it and I can play it if I want to. I'm going to play you a little bit of Boogie Woogie just so if you're not familiar with what it sounds like and feels like, you'll get an idea right quick. This is a song called Blue Note Boogie by James P. Johnston. So that's what Boogie Woogie sounds like. And this was quite revolutionary back at the time that it was thought up, because nobody had ever heard music that rocked. So what these early players did is they gave us the first music that rocked. To a great extent, they were inspired by the sound of the railroad trains. They worked out in the woods of East Texas, and the trains were everywhere. The trains brought them into the woods, and it brought the lumber out of the woods. And so you notice that one of the characteristics of Boogie Woogie is always has this thing in the lower part, the left hand, that's over and over like. This was an attempt by the Boogie Woogie piano players to recreate the sound of a train. And then they would add to that various other effects that you would hear being around in a railroad yard. And here's a little bit of a song called Honky Tonk Train Blues that really illustrates that. So a lot of what they're playing there, you have this part here. It sounds like they're coupling train cars together. And then there's other parts that sound like a whistle blowing as the train comes down the track. So they used the sound that inspired them to create a form of music that nobody had ever heard before. Now, I told you that these piano players were blues piano players. Now, blues music was music that African Americans already had when they came to America. When they came here, they brought their own musical forms, and African music is different from what we call Western music because they have different notes in their scales. Western music uses the scale that we're all familiar with, and Western music can be illustrated by one song. This song is a song I'm sure everybody's heard. It's a Christmas hymn called Joy to the World. And the first line of Joy to the World goes, da, 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 da. That's all the notes in the Western scale. But African music doesn't sound like that. It has different notes that are in between the notes in the Western scale. A good example of that is the very first line of a song that was done by many people, but Ray Charles made a recording of it. It's called Sinner's Prayer. And it goes, Lord have mercy. Those notes are the notes in the African music scale. The first note is in between, Lord have mercy. Those 5 notes make up the whole African music scale. And so when the Black population got to America, they had a hard time making their kind of music because the musical instruments only played the notes in the Western scales. So they discovered that if you took a harmonica and they blew on it hard enough, they can make those notes that are in between our notes. We call those notes blue notes today. But by blowing a harmonica really hard, you can bend the notes and make them slightly flat or sharp. So they had great success with that. And likewise, with an instrument like a saxophone, you can blow on it hard enough to make the notes that are in between. But when it comes to playing piano, that's a pretty tall order. You've got black notes and white notes, and that's all there is. But they managed over time to learn how to play in a style that made you think you were hearing the notes in between the black ones and the white ones. If you were Beethoven and you played a G chord, it would just sound like this. Just straight notes. But if you were a blues piano player, you could create the effect of having the notes in between the blacks and the white ones, like this. So that's a technique they use to play blues music on the piano. Now, eventually, the boogie woogie style spread out all over Texas. It was still called Texas style music. But when they put out sheet music for songs, then the sheet music would say, for example, the first sheet music said, Pine Top's Boogie Woogie. And so people started assuming that Boogie Woogie was the name of the music. And so we lost the definition of Texas style music, unfortunately. So nobody knows now, very few people know that Boogie Woogie started in Texas. But in every Boogie Woogie song, there's a phrase you're liable to hear, and it goes like this. That's from Pine Top's Boogie Woogie, and it was incorporated in a lot of other Boogie Woogie songs. The other thing about Boogie Woogie that makes it different from most kinds of music is you can only play Boogie Woogie on a piano. You can't whistle Boogie Woogie, you can't sing Boogie Woogie, and you can't play it on a trumpet. You can only play it on a piano. And Boogie Woogie always has to have something going on in the left hand that's over and over, repetitive. In musical terms, that's called ostinato. So that's what all Boogie Woogie is based on, those repetitive figures. When the Boogie Woogie players got together, they would talk to each other, and they had pet names for their different left-hand patterns. A common left-hand pattern they used was based on what a bass would do. A bass would play, but with a piano, you can jazz it up and make it a lot more complicated. We call that a walking bass, but the boogie woogie piano players call it swamp poodle. Now, swamp poodle doesn't have anything to do with dogs. It has to do with a part of Texarkana up in far northeast Texas, where that was the what you call red light district or black section of town, and it flooded a lot. It was very swampy, and it was called the swamp puddle. But eventually, it started becoming the swamp poodle. And so when the boogie woogie piano players would say, "Hey, man, give me a little swamp poodle," then that's what they would play. So eventually, they started making records of boogie woogie songs, and the world loved boogie woogie because boogie woogie is so happy. It became an antidote to the blues. Blues is kind of music mostly played by people who are depressed. I mean, it doesn't make them feel much better, but it gives them a chance to vent. Where boogie woogie makes it so happy that it becomes like an antidote to the blues. So by listening to boogie woogie, it becomes a cure for the blues. So if you're feeling like you had the blues today, by the time you listen to a little boogie woogie, you're going to be feeling a whole lot better about everything. Now, during the 40s, people rediscovered boogie woogie as they started having it played by big bands. And almost every big band like Glenn Miller or Tommy Dorsey started incorporating a boogie woogie song into their repertoire because people learned that they could dance to it and do the jitterbug or swing dancing. And so that caused a rejuvenation of boogie woogie. And then from boogie woogie emerged first jump blues and then eventually rock and roll. So all rock and roll owes its heritage to boogie woogie. And boogie woogie was the first music that rocked. Before boogie woogie, you had marching band music, you had folk music, you had hillbilly music, but none of it rocked like boogie woogie did. So that's what became the inspiration for the creation of rock and roll and all rock music. And it phased over into jazz and swing. Anybody got any questions? Is anybody out there?
I have a question.
Okay.
I know based on what you played, I heard some what I've come to understand or know of as stride piano. Is that part of what you were playing, or is it a predecessor to that? Or
stride piano came out as a type of boogie woogie later that could only be played by really good piano players, because the characteristic of stride piano is in the left hand, instead of just playing one pattern, they have to play a low note and then a chord. That's not exactly my specialty, but that's what stride piano sounds like. And also along with stride piano was another similar style that we call ragtime.
Yeah.
Ragtime differs from boogie woogie because it's a way of, both of them are a way of taking traditional music and putting an African stamp on it. With boogie woogie, they did it with the notes. And in ragtime, they did it with the rhythm. So ragtime is actually short for ragged time, and it makes an extreme syncopation. I can't play any ragtime, but if I could, you would understand what I'm talking about. And with the creator of ragtime was Scott Joplin, who grew up in Texarkana. He moved to Memphis and started publishing these ragtime piano pieces. His first big hit was called Maple Leaf Rag. And those pieces are, they can be played without any blue notes, but they're played with extremely syncopated rhythm. And so that was another influence of African music on the world of music, was through the rhythms they brought over from Africa. The word boogie woogie actually is two African words. Boogie means to beat on something, and woogie means to dance. So you got somebody beating on something, and you got people dancing, and it just doesn't get any better than that, right? So that's where the phrase boogie woogie comes from.
A question. What are there African instruments that make those blue notes?
As far as I know, they could be made with stringed instruments because you can change the tension on the strings. That's why it's pretty easy to play the blues on guitar. You just bend the notes. Other than that, it's pretty much all about singing, because you can sing those notes that are in between the flats and sharps if you're an authentic blues singer. So when somebody sings the blues, they're singing notes that are in between the regular notes. If they're not, it's not really blues. Okay. Like that Ray Charles song that I just played. It goes like this. Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy on me. Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy on me. If I've done somebody wrong now, have mercy on me, if you please. So you can hear all those blue notes in there. And that song is called Sinner's Prayer. And that should tip you off to something else. And that is the big influence of church music. When the Black people interpreted church hymns, the way that they sang it was actually blues. And it wasn't usually quite as rocking as boogie woogie, but there was definitely an influence there. When Ray Charles merged church music with blues music, a lot of people were very upset. But the result was what we call now soul music. That's where soul music came from. It's a merger of church music with a more secular lyrics. It brings the tears into my eyes when I began to realize I cried so much since you've been gone. I guess I'll drown in my own tears. When he first brought out that song, some of the members of his band actually quit because they thought it was sacrilegious to play church music and then sing songs that were more like pop songs. But it was brilliant, and that's why Ray Charles is considered a genius. They don't call him the genius for nothing. He had some great ideas, and he just did what came naturally to him. Any other questions? What about you, Artie? You look like you're brimming with questions back there. I wish that.
Turn your mic on, Artie.
Huh?
Tell Artie turn her mic on.
Okay, thank you. No, I just said that it just sounded like one of the TV shows. What I didn't know, I didn't think I knew that, and so I'm listening to you on some of the things I thought I knew, but I didn't. So I'm learning a lot.
Well, good. It's just something that's always fascinated me since I was little, and I had a big band for years. For 30 years, I played with my own band, and we put out CDs and I wrote songs. But at some point, I decided to retire, and what that gave me the opportunity to do was, instead of playing every night of the week somewhere, I could sit down and further study the things that interested me. And so I put together this show called The Story of Boogie Woogie, where my son plays drums with me, but basically it's what you'd call a one-man show, where I do a lot of talking about Boogie Woogie, and we play a whole bunch of famous Boogie Woogie songs. But people invariably leave that show and they're thinking, man, I never knew all that stuff.
Right.
You know,
Right.
a lot of stuff. One of the interesting things about Boogie Woogie, it was created in East Texas, and there's a man who's a historian named Dr. John Tennyson, who went to a lot of research and trouble to figure out exactly where Boogie Woogie started, and he came to the conclusion the only logical place was Marshall, Texas.
Yay for Marshall.
All right.
Somebody
that's
from
what I'm
Marshall here?
doing.
Wiley College. That's where Conrad went.
Oh, okay.
That's what we have performed as well. Well, again, Claude let us there to perform for the alumni at Wiley College in Marshall, Texas.
Well, he
Yeah.
My
recently,
family is from Marshall.
the state of Texas last year finally installed a historical marker right in the middle of downtown Marshall, proclaiming Marshall, Texas to be.
Hello, what happened?
I think we lost him for a minute.
Do you hear him, Charlie?
He isn't in the call anymore. I don't see him.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was muted. We lost. He's not in the room.
What happened?
Uh-oh.
Do I need to call him? Is something on our end?
Yeah, call him and make sure he knows. But I'm sure he knows. We probably all just disappeared. But yeah.
Okay.
Be right back for a few seconds. Hold on.
But there's nothing on our end. We can do it, right?
Oh.
Okay. Okay then. No problem. Okay. Bye. He'll be back in a minute.
Oh, he's rejoining.
Yeah. He said something lost batteries.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. If it was a laptop or something, you know.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm back. Okay. That's really stupid to let your laptop run out of battery in the middle of a Zoom session. I'm back. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
But you were talking about the marker there in Marshall, in downtown Marshall.
The reason that Dr. Tennyson was able to prove that Marshall was the birthplace or the ground zero of Boogie Woogie is it's the only place that has all three of the ingredients that caused Boogie Woogie to be created. First of all, it's in Harrison County, and after the Civil War ended, Harrison County had the largest population of Black people in the whole state of Texas. And the reason for that was after the Civil War was over, a lot of the freed slaves moved to Texas, and the first place they came to after they crossed over from Louisiana was up there in the Marshall region. So they had the population to create these lumber camps. The second reason is they had the whole Piney Woods forest where the United States was in a big building boom as the Civil War ended, and they needed a lot of lumber. And so they set up a big industry there. And the third ingredient was railroads. And Marshall, Texas was the railroad capital of East Texas. The railroads didn't come to Marshall. You know, there's scenes in Western movies where they're saying, okay, we're gonna put the railroad through here. The railroad's coming through town. No, they actually started the railroads in Marshall. They shipped in locomotives and rails, and they built rail lines from Marshall out to the surrounding towns and into the woods there to Palestine and Rusk and Jefferson, Texas. And so that was the magic third ingredient to prove that was the only place where all of the conditions could exist that would cause Boogie Woogie to be created. I recently got a chance to play one of my concerts in Jefferson, Texas, which is about 20 miles north of Marshall.
Yeah.
And, that is a fascinating place and still remains untouched by civilization for the most part. But Jefferson, in that period of time, was the second largest city in Texas after Galveston. Galveston was the biggest city in Texas, and the second biggest city was Jefferson. And there was a simple reason for it. It was a big port because part of the Red River had gotten backed up into the area that's Caddo Lake and Jefferson. And steamboats were coming up from New Orleans on a regular basis all the way up the river. They'd come all the way up the Sabine River and into Jefferson. And Jefferson was a huge steamboat town. And sometime about 1880, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers figured out the reason for all that backup of water. It was a massive log jam down in the river that had existed for 100 years. So they decided the smart thing to do would be to dynamite it and get it out of the way. Well, when they did that, all the water disappeared from Jefferson, and there was no longer a big port. There was no water for the steamboats to come up in. But in its heyday, that would have been where they would bring up the locomotives and rails and everything for the railroad, and then they would take them over to Marshall. So I was able to play one of my Boogie Woogie concerts there in a hotel called the Excelsior, that is the oldest hotel in Texas, the oldest continuously operating hotel. I went there on a visit, and I went in the ballroom, and they had a 9-foot Baldwin concert grand piano. And I talked to the lady, the tour guide, and I said, you know, there's something we could do here in this ballroom with this piano. And so it took about 6 months, but 6 months later, we put on a big concert for the whole town and raised a lot of money for their garden club. So if you ever get a chance to go to Marshall, it's a fascinating place. It's now called the bed and breakfast capital of Texas.
Yeah.
Because all of the homes there have been converted to tourist destinations and bed and breakfasts. And
you know,
downtown is fascinating.
Yeah, you know, Ezra, up there in Marshall, up there in that East Texas area, you got the Piney Woods of East Texas. That's what they're called. Piney Woods of East Texas, Marshall, Nacogdoches, Center, all of those places. They're still ran by industries like lumber and
stockyards.
Yes, and of course chickens. Tyson chickens.
Chickens.
Yeah, chickens, lumber, and yeah, and railroad. And all those railroads are still up there. You know, crossing, almost dividing the city or the town, whatever you want to call it. Still.
I was born in Texarkana.
Okay.
Because my father worked there during World War II at the Red River Armory, where they made all the ammunition during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And but my father and my mother and all of their relatives lived in Nacogdoches.
Right. Okay.
So I consider Nacogdoches to be my ancestral hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved to Beaumont when I was 5 or 6, because my father got a job there, and I grew up in Beaumont.
And because, see, I thought Nacogdoches was the largest, not the largest, but the oldest city in Texas.
Well, it's the oldest city, but Jefferson was the second largest after Galveston.
Okay. After Galveston.
We had those ports that's where people were able to easily come into town and do business. For places like Nacogdoches, you had to travel on a horseback. So horses and wagons don't bring near as many
Horses and
people in as a
wagons.
steamboat.
Mhm.
And
The Winter brothers were both from Beaumont too, weren't they?
yes.
Okay.
When I was in the 9th grade, we had 2 new arrivals at our school. It was Johnny and Edgar Winter. Johnny was my age. He was in the 9th grade, and his little brother Edgar was in the 7th grade. And they were both albinos. And they had not been to public schools up until then. They had been homeschooled, and they'd been to some special schools for the handicapped, because being albino means you have very poor vision. An albino doesn't have any color in their eyes. And so their eyesight is always like your eyes have been dilated, and they don't have the ability to close down when you enter a bright area of bright lights. And so their vision was very limited. But both of them had been at home all that time, especially Johnny. He was fascinated by music and had learned how to play the guitar in his bedroom. And he was getting records shipped into him from Memphis and Nashville almost every day. Every new record that came out, his parents were very well off, and they lived in a giant mansion in the best side of Beaumont. And when he came to the school, he and Johnny both got in talent shows. And I thought, well, these guys are really great. They're going to have a band, and I want to be in it. So I had a friend of mine that sat next to Johnny in his home room, and he agreed to show me this friend was going to show me some guitar. So I got my father to borrow a guitar from some friend of his at the refinery in Beaumont, and I tried to learn how to play it because I already knew how to play the ukulele. And I was over at my friend's house, and we were getting nowhere because I was terrible at the guitar. My fingers are too little and pointed. And so we took a break, and I went over and started playing the piano. And he said, man, why are you trying to learn how to play the guitar when you already know how to play the piano? You could be the piano player in the band. So he agreed to introduce me to Johnny. And so I had an audition the next day at the band hall at the school. Johnny came to the band hall when school was out with this guitar player's name was David Holliday, and he became the drummer in this band. And he came to the band hall, and so I sat down and said, okay, well, let me play you this thing. And I played this song, it went like this. I'd learned that off of a record. And it's actually the backside of a very popular hit record called Raunchy by Dwayne Eddy, which is a big guitar solo thing. And obviously Johnny already had that record, and he probably had already learned the song on the A side. And to hear somebody play the song on the B side just blew his mind. It's like, that's the greatest thing I could have done to impress him, to work something up off of a record. He was immediately like, okay, you're in, you're the piano player. So we started playing with Johnny and Edgar both had guitars, and David Holliday had a drum set that consisted of a kick drum and a cymbal and a snare drum. That was it. We managed to go to the music store and talk them out of a kick pedal, and so we could play. And so the first time we ever played was a prom. We got to the prom, and they had a big Glenn Miller type orchestra playing there that night, and our job was to play the breaks. Whenever the orchestra would take a break for 15 minutes on the hour, we got to play. And so the first time we went up on stage, we had just one guitar amp, and Johnny and Edgar both plugged their guitars into that, and then they had a microphone plugged into it for Johnny to sing. And I would play on the piano that was there on the left side where the orchestra used it, and we'd set up the drums right by the piano. And as soon as we played the first song, the crowd, the kids went crazy because Johnny could play every Chuck Berry song ever. He would start off by playing Johnny Be Good, and that was it. It was over. The kids would go to their parents and say, we don't want this orchestra, get rid of them. We want these guys to play the rest of the night. And they would fire the orchestra, pass the hat, raise about $50 to pay us, and we would play the whole night. And Johnny could, not only could he play all the Chuck Berry songs, he could play Jimmy Reed songs, which are kind of blues stuff, you know, and he could play all those swamp pop things like Matilda, and the kids loved it. And we did the same routine over and over and over. I'll never forget the last time we played. It was in a big convention center in Beaumont on the fairgrounds. There was a place called the Harvest Club, huge convention center ballroom. We got there, same old deal. By then we had, by the end of the school year, we were dressing in black slacks and red short sleeve shirts, all alike. And we went on stage, and the same thing happened. They fired the orchestra immediately. And at the end of the night, one of the parents came over to pay us. And you got to bear in mind, we're in a giant convention center, and still all we have is this one little Fender amp with the 2 guitars and the mic in it. And I'm just playing the piano acoustically, and the drum set is so little, it's a joke, you know. And this parent came over and he paid us the money, and he said, "You boys are real good, but do you have to play so loud?" And I can only imagine that this guy's head must have exploded sometime in the ensuing years. But I went to school the Monday morning, and I played flute and piccolo in the high school bands, orchestras. And I got to school, and the oboe player sat next to me, and he said, "Well, I heard you played a dance Saturday night." I said, "Yeah, we did." And I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Well, my father plays the saxophone in the dance band, and he showed up back at home real early, like 9 o'clock. And we said, "What are you doing home?" And he said, "We got fired. They had this band of 3 albinos." And because I was kind of a cotton top anyway, and so I guess they thought I was also an albino. And well, that was my first experience playing in a band, and I never got over it.
Okay.
I have to tell you that during this coronavirus pandemic, I have written a book, and it's called Backstories. It's got 45 chapters, and every chapter is a story like I just told you. That's chapter 2, the Winter Brothers. I just pretty much recited the whole chapter word for word, everything you just heard. And I'm in the process of getting the book published now. So I know everybody will look forward to getting a copy of it and reading it, but it's got 44 other stories just like that of what happened to me over the years as I met various famous people and was able to learn everything I did about both the music business and the musical instrument business, because I invented this microphone for pianos. And so anyway, look for my book. That's all I can say. Any other questions?
Yeah. I saw a hand. I thought.
A hand?
I thought
Yeah.
somebody.
Hi, Vincent. I had a question. I'm a big Boogie Woogie fan myself, and Albert Ammons and Pete Johnson had a famous piece where they played together, I think, on 2 pianos. Do you know anything about that? What made them to come?
Well, that's a story I've never heard. I know a similar story.
Playing together and having 2 pianos.
Pete Johnson had, his most famous song was called Rollin' Pete. And it was a boogie woogie song that everybody just loved. And he went into the studio one time and he played Rollin' Pete, and they brought in to the studio Big Joe Turner. Big Joe Turner was what you call a blues shouter. In those days, most orchestras also had a vocalist that would come on and do novelty songs. And he had songs like Shake, Rattle, and Roll, way back before what we call rock and roll. And so they went in the studio, and Pete Johnson played Rollin' Pete, and Big Joe Turner sang with him, just kind of made up a song on the spot and sang it on top of what Pete was playing. And it sounded kind of like this. I got a gal, she lives up on a hill. Well, I got a gal, she lives up on a hill. Well, the woman trying to quit me, but you know I love her still. She got eyes like diamonds, shine like Klondike gold. She got eyes like diamonds, shine like Klondike gold. Yeah, when I'm down loving that you move my mellow soul. Well, you're so beautiful, but you gotta die someday. Well, you're so beautiful, but you gotta die someday. All I want's a little loving now before you pass away. And so it goes on and on like that. And in spite of what people will tell you about what was the first rock and roll song, it definitely wasn't Bill Haley in the Comets doing Shake, Rattle, and Roll. And it wasn't Ike Turner doing Rocket 88s, because those songs took place in the late 40s and early 50s. This recording with Big Joe Turner and Pete Johnson was done in 1937. So from what I just played and what you heard, that is definitely a rock and roll record. So I would date the birth of rock and roll to the day that Big Joe Turner sat in with Pete Johnson and they did Rollin' Pete. As far as one of my close contacts and friends and mentors was Professor Longhair in New Orleans. And near the end of his life, they decided to do a PBS documentary on Toots Washington and Alan Toussaint and Professor Longhair. And they started the rehearsals down in New Orleans. This was in 1980. And Professor Longhair had played on one of my pianos before, and they called me from New Orleans. They said, is there any way we could borrow your piano for Professor Longhair to play in this documentary? I said, I would be honored. I'd love that. And so I started making arrangements to ship the piano to New Orleans, and they were rehearsing right then. But then I got another call the very next day, and they said, well, we don't need the piano because Professor Longhair passed away in his sleep last night. So they never actually made the documentary. Eventually they issued what they had filmed of the rehearsals. And the name of the tape is called Piano Players Rarely Play Together. So that's what I thought of when Ben started to ask me about Pete Johnson and Albert Ammons. The main reason is there's rarely two pianos together. Unfortunately, piano players tend to congregate around one piano. I did have a chance in the 70s to play a duet with Leon Russell. And that occurred because I went to his house in Tulsa, and I wanted to meet him. And so I went to his house, I found out where he lived, and it was in like the River Oaks section of Tulsa, big houses. And I went up to the front door one afternoon, and it was open about 6 inches. So I just kind of pushed the door open and went on in. And I looked around, and in a minute, Leon Russell and a bunch of groupies came walking into this big room where there was nothing but a grand piano and some beanbag chairs. So I said, I told him who I was, and he said, well, do you ever play four-handed piano? And I said, yeah. So we went over and sat down at his piano, and I sat down at the low end because I figured if I played on the low side, he wouldn't figure out how deficient I was compared to him. So I was playing, and he was up at the top end playing. He was all over the piano. And this went on for about 30 minutes. And finally, everybody had left the room except me and him and his cousin. who was a guy that looked just like him, except he had a cowboy hat on and short hair. So he's sitting in a beanbag chair and we're at the piano. And Leon started giving me all these tips and secrets. He said, he says, be careful and don't ever practice around your woman or she'll leave you. So I took that advice to heart. And then he said, I want to show you a secret. And his cousin sat up in the beanbag chair like, oh no, you're not going to tell him that, are you? So I got really excited at that point. And so he said, I want to show you a little exercise. And he started playing on the piano. He started going. And so I started playing the same thing right along with him. And he started talking to me. He said, now, the secret of this exercise is what you think about when you're playing. He said, I want you to play this exercise over and over, and I want you to first think exactly about what you're doing. Then after you played that for a while, I want you to let your mind wander and don't think about it at all. Think about anything you want to, but not about what you're playing. And he said, after you've done that for a while, I want you to try to come back to a halfway point where you're kind of thinking about what you're doing, but not at the same time. If you can find that midpoint, you'll be in the zone and you'll be able to play concerts for 20,000 people. Then he said, I figure this lesson is worth about $50,000. Now, I thought that was a bargain at the time, as that's only $2.50 per person in the audience. But I told him, well, I'll have to pay you later. And he said, okay. And then about 10 years later, he came to town and played at Rockefeller's. And I went backstage to see him. And he saw me. It was like a whole backstage was full of people. And he spotted me from the far side of the room and stood up and came walking over to me. He said, where's my $60,000? And I said, I thought it was $50,000. And he said, well, after all this time, the interest is starting to mount up. So we had a good laugh, and we became, fairly close from that point on. But that was the most valuable time I got to play with another piano player. And it was because we were able to sit down at the same piano and play together. Any other questions?
Any other questions, comments? Nobody's saying anything. Got to think about it or what?
It's such a wide subject to talk about how important the African American influence was on American pop music that you don't know where to start. It's just vast. It's a subject that I've spent my life studying. And,
So what would you say would be the main difference between, say, boogie woogie, jazz, blues, and things people may like to lump into the same basket?
Well, blues has to come first. It starts with the field hollers. Oh, I'm tired of working. Why will the sun go down? Then when they got instruments, they were able to play guitars and take that same style of music. Boogie Woogie came along and made it danceable and made it rock. And everything follows from that. Jazz, Louis Armstrong introduced the concept that you can both play and sing something different from the song. He was the first person to play a solo that he didn't just play the melody. He played something totally different. And likewise, when he would sing a song, he could change the melody to whatever he wanted, and it still worked. And that was the birth of jazz. And swing music, once again, was just a form of boogie woogie that was able to be danced to, that was able to be played by the big band style orchestras. And
I have a question.
Hmm?
I have a question.
Okay. Is your mic on?
Well, why is it called?
What happened to the mic?
You're cutting in and out.
Why is it called Boogie Woogie?
Well, it's two African words. Boogie means to beat on something, and woogie means to dance. So in this case, you got somebody beating on the piano and you got somebody dancing, which is the guys that cut down the trees. So the African people that came to America, they didn't forget their old languages. They just didn't teach them to anybody, including their kids for the most part. When I was around Professor Longhair in New Orleans, he is a man who was born in the 1920s and died in 1980. He died at the ripe old age of 63. So he didn't live as long as he should have. But even he would incorporate phrases into his songs that I don't even know if he knew what they meant. He would say, this is a song called Tipatina. Listen to this verse in Tipatina. Tipatina, tra-la-la-la. Tipatina, tra-la-la. Tipatina, a mala walla dollar. Try my tina now. Now, I don't even know if Professor Longhair still remembered what Ula Mala Walla Dalla meant.
I was just gonna ask.
I'm sure that was some African phrase that he had heard from his ancestors that he never forgot. Ula Mala Walla Dalla. And he liked the sound of it, and he made it into that first verse.
Cool.
Well, I think this is, very, what's a valuable history lesson. Youth, I think you really need to really focus and pay attention, because this is going to be in your repertoire at some point in time as to who you met through your lifetime. You know, it's very important to respect and really honor the giants that's coming before you. You know, I mean, it's really important. And, a lot of stuff you're not going to find in the history book because they're not putting it in there. So give kudos to Miss Artie and Toya and Mr. Israel for coming in, giving you guys this information, because you can't find it. It's not published. Yeah. And you're meeting somebody in your lifetime. You're going to be the next musician, a generation of musicians that's going to be carrying the torch and the legacy. So it's, thank you, Mr. Charles. I remember Edgar Winter and Jonathan Winter, as a guitar player, I played bass, and I played his records and stuff way back in the day when I was playing. But, here I'm meeting somebody who played with John and Edgar Winter, when I was in the streets playing guitar, and that was one of my idolizers as a guitar player. And here it is some years later, I'm meeting a person who's played with these guys. And that's really, really, really important. So I never thought I'd live to meet somebody who played with Jonathan Winters and Edgar Winters, but here it is. Yeah. So that's why I'm saying that it's important, because you don't never know who you're going to meet through your journey of being a musician, and take this day as a day of importance. So that's what that's what I got out of it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It is going to be published in my book.
Okay, that's fine.
Hopefully I will. People for years have said, you've got all these stories. You need to write all this down. And yes. I was lucky enough that we had a coronavirus pandemic that trapped me in my house for 3 months, and I was forced to write a book. And now I've got it finished, and it's being sent off to the publisher. The book's called Backstories, and it's all of those little stories I used to tell.
So when will you know, Ezra, when will you know when the book is gonna come out? Do you already know, or?
Well, it takes a lot longer to put out a book than you would think, but
Yeah.
I'm planning to have a book launch party in October.
Okay.
And hopefully the coronavirus pandemic will be over to the extent where you can actually have a group of people get together and do something. But I will definitely let you guys know when and where it's going to be, because I'd love to have all of you show up
Okay.
and,
Okay. Okay.
get an
Thank you.
autographed
Thank
copy
you
of the
so
book.
much.
Huh?
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Sound like a plan.
Thanks for the lesson, Mr. Charles.
Thank you. Now, what do you play?
I play trombone.
Trombone. Well, my bands have always had trombone players. I've always had bands that had trumpet, trombone, and saxophone. And my trombone players have always been girls.
Oh.
For many years, all of the horn players in my band were girls. And there was a very simple reason for it. And that was when they weren't playing, they could sing. And they were my Raylettes. They were the Ezrets, I guess. They could sing all the harmony stuff. I can't imagine how you can afford to have a band and have girls that just sing. What do they do the rest of the time? Just stand there? Not my girls. They all had to play horns. So I had a trumpet player and a sax player. And people just loved that. So I'm very familiar with trombones.
You know, even that's interesting, because recently, you know, you didn't see that many girl trombonists or saxophonists. So it's good to know that when you had your band, I mean, they were serving a dual role there. They were instrumentalists as well as vocalists. Yeah, like the only lone girl that we have in our band. She's multi-talented, and she can sing and play a couple of instruments. So that's good. So don't be surprised. You may see some people coming, I mean, through the email, Mr. Charles, and asking you questions, because this is really, it's not music, but it's history, something that they could take, like Mr. Robinson said, something that we would not have known if you hadn't done this presentation. And like I said, and then how, you know, and the fact that you have used your skills to really get some places in the world, really be a success in different places or different aspects of your life from the music. And that's pretty much what we're trying to say to the kids. Use that music, use those skills, or use that discipline that they have in music to do pretty much what they ever want to do. They can make a really good living with what they have now, if they will. So we don't have a lot of questions, but I
have one question for Mr. Charles. I think it was Edgar or Johnny. Okay, I think they invented like the slide guitar, where they had this metal brass piece that they would play on the guitar that would make it sound like a steel guitar. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah, Johnny was pretty good at playing slide guitar.
Okay.
He wasn't the first person to do that, or the most famous.
Okay.
The master of the slide guitar was Dwayne Allman of the Allman Brothers.
The Allman Brothers.
But
Dwayne and Greg Allman.
Before him, there were plenty of acoustic blues guitar players. Like, I don't know that I ever saw Lightnin Hopkins play slide guitar, but there were people similar to Lightnin that came up with the idea of playing slide guitar, and they started out using little glass medicine bottles,
right,
that would fit over their finger. Right. I did get to do a lot of playing with Lightnin Hopkins back in the 70s.
Wow.
Lightnin Hopkins used to regularly play at a club called Liberty Hall in the 70s, and it was a concert kind of place, and they would bring Lightnin in to do shows. I saw him, I went to Rice and I saw him play little private concerts for the Rice students. But then when he started playing at Liberty Hall, the guy in charge liked the idea of calling in a bunch of musicians to form a band behind Lightnin. And I got to do that several times. then eventually they dedicated a historical marker to him down on Dowling Street. And I went to the ceremony, and there was a historian there who explained that Lightnin Hopkins much preferred to play by himself. He hated to play with other people. So because of that, I'm one of the few people that ever got to play with Lightnin Hopkins as a band. He almost never did that. He was very polite and never told us that he didn't like it. But the last time we played together, one of his most famous songs was called Mr. Charlie. And so all night long, some guy in the audience kept yelling, Mr. Charlie, Mr. Charlie. He wanted to hear that song. And Lightnin refused to play the song, or he never did. But I think he didn't like the idea of the guy yelling at him. So we came down to the end of the night, and Lightnin decided to introduce the band. Now, this was kind of a strange idea for him to do because he didn't know any of our names. He knew the bass player, Rusty, because Rusty picked him up at his house and drove him to the gig and set up his guitar and his amp for him and set a chair up for him to sit on. So he said, well, I want to introduce my band players to you now. He said, over on the bass, we got Mr. Rusty. Let's have a big hand for Mr. Rusty. He says, Mr. Rusty don't cut nobody's dusty. And I have no idea what that means. But anyway, then he looked around at the rest of us and he realized he had a problem. And he said, well, this here is my harp blower, my harmonica man. And it was Tommy Dardar. And Tommy leaned down behind him and said, he whispered in his ear and said, it's Tommy. And so Lightnin said, and on the harmonica, we got Mr. Tommy on the harmonica. And so now he got a big smile on his face because he knew he had a plan. All he had to do was look at somebody, and Tommy would lean down and tell him the name in his ear, and he could introduce him. And he said, back on the drums, we got Roberto on the drums. And on the guitar, we got Rocky Hill. And finally, I was the last one to be introduced. He looked at me on the other side of a big grand piano. And Tommy leaned down and he said, that's Charlie on the piano. And Lightnin said, on the piano, we got Mr. Charlie on the piano. And so on that note, he felt inclined to finally do the song, Mr. Charlie. And then I was approached at the end of the night by the man running the soundboard, and he said, I have a cassette of that last set if you want it. So I have a cassette of Lightnin introducing me as Mr. Charlie and then doing the song Mr. Charlie. Years later, I was playing one of my Boogie Woogie shows, and sometimes we would do Mr. Charlie as an encore. And the song Mr. Charlie is about a little boy that stuttered. He stuttered so bad he had to leave home because everybody made fun of the way he talked. And he came into a little town in East Texas where they had a big sawmill. They call it the rolling mill. The little boy found out the rolling mill belonged to Mr. Charlie. So he found Mr. Charlie and went up to him and said, Mama, Mr. Charlie. And Mr. Charlie looked down at him and said, well, what you want with me, boy? And the little boy said, I want to work. And Mr. Charlie said, well, you're too little to work, boy. Just get on out of here. And the little boy turned around and he walked away crying. And Mr. Charlie felt sorry for him. He said, well, come back here a minute, boy. I think there's something you can do for me here at the rolling mill. So I got an old shack out behind the rolling mill, and you can live in that little shack as long as you want to. You only have to do one thing for me, and that's to keep an eye on the rolling mill. So the little boy moved in that little shack, and he was tickled to death to have a place to live. Now, one Sunday morning, the little boy woke up, and he looked at it, and sure enough, the rolling mill had caught on fire. He went running up the road to Mr. Charlie's house, and he found Mr. Charlie out in the backyard working on his rose bushes. And he came running up to Mr. Charlie and started pulling on his pants leg going, Mr. Charlie. And Mr. Charlie said, what you bothering me about now, boy? Can't you see I'm busy? And the little boy was so excited he couldn't hardly talk. He just kept saying, what the And Mr. Charlie said, if you can't say what you're trying to tell me, boy, why don't you just sing it? And the little boy went, whoa, Mr. Charlie, your rolling mill is burning down. And he said, whoa, Mr. Charlie, your rolling mill is burning down. And Mr. Charlie said, well, we ain't got no water, boy. Just have to let that old mill burn down to the ground. The little boy started going, whoa, Mr. Charlie, I won't have no place to stay. Whoa, Mr. Charlie, I won't have no place to stay. And Mr. Charlie said, well, you can live right here with me, boy, long as there is a day.
That was great.
So I was playing one of my Boogie Woogie shows, so we did that song for Encore. And this guy came up to me later from the audience, and he said, did you ever find out who it was that night? They kept yelling Mr. Charlie at the audience. I said, no, I have no way to know that. He said, well, it was me. He said, I'm sorry, I was just really drunk that night.
Okay.
That's a story of me and Lightnin Hopkins, and that's another whole chapter in my book. We keep this up, we'll go through the whole 45 chapters. You won't have to buy a book because I've already told it to you. Yeah.
And then it'll be a recap after that.
Well, you can't hear me sing in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So you got a little bonus there.
You get a bonus. I have a question. Did you say you went to Rice?
Yes.
Did you study music there?
No, you couldn't major in music when I went to Rice. I majored in electrical engineering.
Okay.
But now, see, there's the connection between music, science, technology, engineering.
And can you talk more about the pickup?
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to say that when I got to Rice, I was surprised that almost all the students were musical. They were all very musically talented. And when I went there, almost everybody that went there was the valedictorian of their high school class. It was free to get in, if you could get in. So they had tons of applications. And I was lucky enough to be in that category, and so I got in. And so I just thought, well, maybe it's a deal that smart people are just more musically talented. But I learned years later that it's the opposite of that. And that is that people that study music as a child become smarter. It creates neural pathways in your brain that makes you better at science and math and linguistics and everything that that your brain is capable of doing. And that's why it's so important for young people to study music. Now, later on at Rice, I waited till I was a senior at Rice to start a band because I knew if I got to playing in bands, I would flunk out. But I did start a band when I was a senior, and I've really never stopped playing bands since then. And I had kind of a Beatle type band back in the late 60s when I was at Rice. And after that fizzled out, I got interested in the idea of playing real piano and not electric piano. So I thought, well, what if I had a piano that was as loud as a guitar. How neat would that be? So I ended up buying a piano, a little grand piano, and I constructed something that was kind of like guitar pickups and put it in there. And when I tried it out, I was surprised because I expected it to be really different sounding. I was going to be like the Jimi Hendrix of piano. Instead, it just sounded like the piano. But there was one difference, and that is you could play as loud as you wanted. So I started using it in my bands at the time, and everybody would come up to me and say, "You're the best piano player we ever heard." And I realized after about a year, it was because I was the only piano player they'd ever actually heard. It was all about the pickup that I put in there. Well, I took the pickup out. Instead of carrying the piano around, I thought, why don't we make the pickup so you can move it to different pianos? And as soon as I did that, I decided maybe I could sell one to somebody. So I went to an Elton John concert that was being held on the campus of Texas A&M. And they tried it out that night and they bought it. They loved it. So the very first one I ever made was bought by Elton John. And it really, I was really worried about it putting a damper on my musical career because I kind of knew what was going to happen. And for about the next 10 years, 8 years, the whole business of building these piano pickups just skyrocketed. And eventually it caused me to have dealings with virtually every famous piano player in the world. So a lot of the chapters in my book have to do with meeting all those people. If it was just people that I saw while I was playing piano, the book would probably have about 5 chapters, but it has 45 because of all the people I got to meet and talk to and how they influenced me and I influenced them. So that's an effort that's still going on. I still have a little company that makes these piano pickups, and the end result was that we discovered about the year 2000 we had a whole new market, and it was churches. So since about the year 2000, most of the ones we make don't go to rock stars anymore, they go to churches. So there are thousands of churches all over the world that when they all want to have a rock concert on Sundays and now, and that's how they do it. They use one of my thing.
So did you actually engineer it, the microphone?
Yeah, and I have 5 different patents, US patents on how it works. And since those patents were all granted in the 80s and 90s, and since then, whenever I would make a new variation, I stopped getting patents because a patent is a way to tell somebody how you do it. And I didn't want anybody to find out. So all of our devices now are what you call proprietary information. You can buy one, but I guess you could take it all apart if you wanted to, but when you take it apart, it doesn't work anymore. So, well, that's the story of what's called a Helpinstill piano pickup, because my last name is Helpinstill. And I was already, I would modestly say, world famous as Charles Helpinstill before I ever created the name Ezra Charles and used it for my performances. That's why I had to have another name. Helpinstill in the music business was already widely known. It would be like if you were Mr. Wurlitzer and said you were going to put on an organ concert, you know. So I had to come up with another name, and I came up with Ezra Charles. And that's been my name for the last 30 years, and that's what everybody calls me. Except when I'm in the office and somebody calls and they say, I want to speak to Mr. Helpinstill, then I have to be Mr. Helpinstill. And when you see the book on the cover, my name on the cover of the book is Ezra Charles Helpinstill.
Okay.
So I kind of combine the 2 names there.
Wow. Anything else, guys?
Good.
Are there any good like boogie woogie movies like that we should watch? Like,
Well, what you should do, go on YouTube. You could just put in Boogie Woogie on YouTube. You'll have dozens of videos because everybody wants to play Boogie Woogie in their living room and film it, you know, put it on YouTube. But there's one girl that I especially enjoy watching, and her name is Stephanie Trick, T-R-I-C-K. When she was only about 18, she started playing in concerts all over the world and festivals. And she put down videos that absolutely define the perfect way to play every Boogie Woogie song. Stephanie Trick. About 4 years ago, a man in Kingwood arranged for her to play a house concert, and I got to go to it and meet her in person and watch her and her husband play the piano. And when it was over, I got to meet her and talk to her, and I told her what I did. And so she wanted me to play some Boogie Woogie stuff. So I said, well, I want you to show me what I'm doing wrong on this song called Boogie Woogie Stomp, Albert Ammons. It's got a very difficult left hand that goes. She watched me play it for a minute. She said, oh, no, you can't do that. Your hand will fall off. And so what she explained to me was I was playing it strictly with moving my hand up and down for every note, but instead my hand should go half as far. My fingers should play every note. When you watch Stephanie Trick, you can tell that. You can watch her do that. And there are a dozen other guys that are equally good, but she's just the best. One of the things that got me interested in Boogie Woogie was a movie that Jim Carrey made called The Majestic that came out of the mid-90s. And the entire soundtrack of the movie is Boogie Woogie. And they had a guy in LA record all of these classic Boogie Woogie numbers. And in the movie, Jim Carrey plays like he can play Boogie Woogie. So that was one of the things that kind of generated my initial interest in all of these classic songs. There's another movie called Cannery Row, in which the entire soundtrack is Dr. John playing Boogie Woogie.
This is Cannery Row.
Cannery Row.
Okay, Cannery Row.
Really a valuable history lesson in addition to being entertaining.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, Stephanie Trick, is she in Houston, or she just came in for that house performance?
Stephanie Trick grew up in St. Louis.
Okay.
And she is of Filipino origin.
Okay.
Her parents are from the Philippines, and she was born in St. Louis, grew up there, and had a piano teacher that helped her learn how to play all this Boogie Woogie stuff. She tours the world now, and she's married to an Italian guy who's also a piano player.
Okay.
And they usually play together. They play concerts together. And they're both very talented. And he admits up front that I'm Italian and I cannot play the Boogie Woogie.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there's not any other questions and comments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Enjoyable.
Well, it's a great
Really
honor for me to
great.
get to talk to you guys, and hope you learned something. And
You learned a lot.
Most definitely.
you can always email me at ezracharles@aol.com. And I have two websites, ezracharles.com, and I have another website.
EzraCharles.com.
EzraCharles.com is, you find the schedule. I still play occasionally. My son's a drummer. He went to HSPVA. He's 23 now, and he's going to college, but he is available to play with me anytime I want to play. And I have formed a little quartet band that I play with now to play all of my old music that I wrote.
Okay, what's your other site?
Helpinstill.com. If you forget that, just go to Google and put in piano pickup, and it'll be the first thing you see.
Okay, gotcha.
Because we have the only thing that really works.
Okay, gotcha.
It's an enviable position to be in, to have a worldwide monopoly on a product that's that basic.
Gotcha.
Are you still using the email Ezra Charles at EzraCharles.com as well?
Yeah, well, you can send to Ezra at EzraCharles.com.
Okay. Okay.
I'll get it that way too.
Okay. All right. Well, I really want to thank you, Ezra, for taking the time out and giving this valuable lesson. You know it's going to be on YouTube at some point, right?
Okay.
Is it still going to be on Facebook, Charlie? No, just YouTube?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right then, guys. So without anything else.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
well,
you, and I've enjoyed it, and we shall talk again.
Thanks for letting me come into your houses and chat with you guys and bang on the piano a little bit.
Okay.
Stay safe.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll see you at HEB.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.
Okay.